So we'll move on now to our next session, which is remembering Ian Jarvie. So as you all may have heard, Ian Jarvie passed away 2.5 weeks ago on Tuesday, May 16th. He was 85 years old when he passed, and he was one of the very important students and research assistants of Karl Popper. So here is a picture of some of Popper's research assistants. You can see here that we've got Jeremy.
Yeah, and Jeremy, since your Pump took that picture, maybe you can give a little bit of explanation who is in this picture for those who don't know and don't recognize the personalities.
Okay. From the top, the extremely fat gentleman there is myself. The next guy down is Arne Petersen, a Danish psychologist with particular interest in animal behavior. Next, David Miller. Next, Alan Musgrave. Next, Ian Jarvie. And at the bottom, Joseph Agassi. And this was taken at a conference on Popper in Prague in, I think, 2007.
So then the question on my mind, at least, and I invite everyone else if they have questions, is Arne Petersen and Alan Musgrave, are they still alive? Because I've tried to find them.
Arne is, as far as I know, very much alive. He is living in France. If once all of this is finished, you email me, I'll send you the best email address that I have for him. Alan, as far as I know, is still alive. He was living in Otago in New Zealand. He is really now getting on in years, and I don't know what his state of health is like.
Okay. Yeah, I did see him still listed on his website, but I just never got any reaction when I tried to reach him.
I think what you might have to do is possibly to contact someone in the philosophy department at Otago and just see if you can discover from them how things are going.
Yes, all right. So, and now perhaps Professor Hakohen, if you could tell us a little bit more what you learned, since you may have to go soon, about the interactions between Popper and Ian Jarvie, or perhaps your own interactions with Ian Jarvie. You are muted at the moment.
Yeah. So, yeah, Ian Jarvie was very kind, very generous with my earlier work on Karl Popper. And I always knew both Ian and Joseph as a pair. That is, you would send an email with a request for a comment or for criticism, and you will get, of course, an immediate barrage from Joseph, full of insights and immediate, and the much more measured response from Ian. Both were very engaged. Ian, you know that both were, Popper's students, in at the London School of Economics, and Jeremy can fill you on many more details than those that I know. I got to know the Popper circle in the 1990s, whereas Jeremy knew them from, I believe, the late 1960s on. And certainly, the middle in 60s. And Ian was always so generous and so supportive. his perspective on the open society and on Popper was, of course, one of a great admirer of Popper's work. The open society, he said, changed his life and the way he viewed the world, and he represented the liberal secularist version of Popper. My own engagement, for example, with Jewish history, which I do right now, this was not something that Ian would be very interested in, whereas Joseph was always extremely interested in it. So I was sorry to see, and many of us participated in the volume that we had for Ian Jarvie, I believe it was just a couple of years ago. Jeremy, were you one of the editors? Or Jeremy and Nimrod, I think, were the editors, or am I remembering incorrectly?
Yes.
And I was very happy to contribute. I was very
but it was in honor of Agassi.
To that.
Agassi.
No, but there was an earlier one in honor of Ian.
Oh yes, but that was about I think 15 years ago, and edited by Sassover and Laor.
That was a fest trip.
Right. I mean,
I contributed, not an editor.
Okay, very well. So it was nice within the context of the first script, which I remember as being a bit more recent, to see Ian again, and I was so sorry to see him go. You know both that they both met in Italy, in Trento last year, which was amazing because Ian did not like to travel. Okay. Ian did not like to travel. And so we tried to get him many times, to conference. And I know Nathaniel Laors and others tried to get him, and he would not come. But then they both met, how nice, in Trento last year. And now they're both gone.
This was the last meeting and the last confrontation, and they discussed the influences of Corona on our lives. The person who brought them there was Stefano Gattei.
Stefano Gattei, that's right.
Yes, and it is my understanding it has been recorded and is available on YouTube somewhere, the conference, is that right? Well, I will find out. But Nimrod, could you maybe tell us also a little bit more about the relation between Ian and Joseph, because they must have
well,
you must have been in the front row.
We were sent a link by Charlie Sawyer of some really brilliant pictures of Joseph Agassi and Ian Jarvie, really young, debating philosophy at Agassi's living room in Herzliya. And I will really recommend you just press that link or put it online somewhere, because the gallery of pictures is really amazing. And for me, it was very moving to remember them yesterday when I watched it. And what I know is that Jarvie was a student at the anthropology department at LSE, and he had trouble with his teachers there, and he was participating in Popper's seminar, and Agassi coordinated him moving from the anthropology department to doing his PhD in anthropology under Popper. And so he was able to complete his studies. And when Agassi went to Hong Kong, he brought Ian upon completing his studies, his PhD, to Hong Kong, and they wrote a book about society in Hong Kong. That was their first work together. And I think Jarvie was able later in their career to do the same and to facilitate Agassiz coming to York University after a long career in BU. And they corresponded daily on every possible subject. And what Malachi was maybe too gentle about was that sometimes you were writing to Yosuke and you got a reply with a CC to Ian, and so suddenly you were asking a question in philosophy 1%, but you had the beautiful privilege of being in the midst of a philosophical conversation at the level of which we don't find anymore on any subject really. And yes, there were extreme differences between the styles of writing, styles of doing philosophy, aesthetic preferences, but they were somehow able to complete each other in a beautiful manner. I really like the work that they did together, because it has I mean, in my view, Jarvie was the best writers among the Popper's students. His English is simply perfect. I can and his sense of temperance and elegance is really remarkable. And of course, Yosuke's originality was a key force in their dialogue. So and their work was able to somehow express both of these virtues superbly.
Yeah, I was asked by Margareta if I could say something, and I wonder if I could just, for those people who don't know anything about Ian, just offer a very quick overview of the sort of stuff that he was doing. He was a really productive scholar and a key figure in the development of critical rationalism. At the same time, he was a very modest man and didn't wish to be the center of attention, so that when Nimrod and I were proposing that there should be a symposium on his work and whether he'd like to participate, he really didn't feel that it would be appropriate. However, while not wishing to have people praise you seems to me both understandable and these days itself really praiseworthy, a key theme in critical rationalism is the importance of intersubjective critical appraisal. And as a result, I think we should overcome Ian's own reluctance to have his work as a focus of attention. However, I'm in many ways a poor choice to talk about him, just in the sense that while I'm appreciative of his work, I didn't know him well and really know of him in purely academic contexts. Thus, while people who were students or friends of his paid testimony to the feedback they got from him and to his sense of humor, this really isn't something that I experienced. In addition, a major interest of his was the sociology and the aesthetics of the cinema. But this is, I fear, an area about which I'm totally ignorant, both in itself and in terms of his own work. What I will say is this: he seems to me to have played a key role in several different fields. His initial training, as was being mentioned, was in anthropology, but he then wrote his PhD under Popper's supervision, on which was based his book, The Revolution in Anthropology. This is a much neglected book. It's important not just as a critical study in anthropology, where he offered important ideas about how we should understand cargo cults, but also, it seemed to me, it's really important, but almost totally neglected as a detailed critical discussion of Popper's ideas about the methodology of social science in the context of concrete issues in the social sciences. He wrote several books and many papers in which he took these issues further. Indeed, one important theme in this context was his work with Agassi on the rationality of magic and related papers. This seems to me an interesting, although I think in the end rather controversial approach, in which he took on some important figures and shibboleths in anthropology. I should also say that a key theme in Jarvie's work was his various contributions with Agassi, both, as I understand it, ones which were published jointly and ones which were published under Agassi's name, but where he benefited a lot from interactions with Jarvie. Second, there are Jarvie's interesting attempts to offer a partly sociological interpretation of Popper's philosophy of science. This again, I think, has been badly neglected. To such an attempt, I personally am very sympathetic, but as in the case of his work on the philosophy of social science, I sometimes take issue with his specific approach. A problem that this highlights, however, is that we seem to me to lack badly a forum for critical exchanges about critical rationalism. One might say, but didn't philosophy of the social sciences under Ian's editorship play such a role? This was in part the case, but the purpose of that journal was rather different, and much of the material was understandably about wider controversies relating to the social sciences, conducted in ways very different from how these things would be done if the people involved were critical rationalists. Jarvie's role as an editor, however, was very important. He worked with Agassi on many different ideas. He was responsible, typically in collaboration, for important collections on critical rationalism. He also had a strong interest in the work of Ernest Gellner. I was taught by Gellner and found him interesting, but at the same time, it seemed to me personally that his underlying approach was far removed from critical rationalism. Although some of his work, for example, his book on psychoanalysis, was much closer to the spirit of critical rationalism, and I felt did things that critical rationalists should have been doing. Ian and Agassi did a lot to make Gellner's papers available, and Ian also wrote about his work. And I think that under Ian's lead, a critical reconsideration of the relationship between Gellner and critical rationalism is badly needed. I've touched on just a few themes from his work. His contributions have been formidable, not least because of the quiet way in which they were made. And I hope with Nimrod to run a symposium with a limited number of scholarly papers on different aspects of his work, which it's even possible might end up being published in the Crit Rat series. Thanks very much.
Can I add to what Jeremy had to say? Is that acceptable, Elise?
Yes, of course.
Yes, it's completely open.
I've just sent out a chat with a few of his landmark contributions, some of basically which Jeremy mentioned, but I think something which Jeremy could have mentioned was his book Concepts and Society, which came out around about 1972, and it was a serious attempt to apply Popper's then very young World 3 knowledge concept to a range of, as Jeremy said, concrete issues in sociology. Now, that could have been a start of a whole program in the social sciences, but it died like various other things do in Popper circles. But anyway, it was a wonderful effort, and it deserves to be better known, like most of his books. The other thing which I think was monumental was his book on the social or institutional turn in Popper's philosophy. There are so many aspects of that, which I won't run through. The cinema was interesting. The editorship of the philosophy of social sciences, very important. But what struck me, I think, was particularly his attempt to get the World 3 idea off the ground and the institutional turn. And the institutional turn was the theme of my contribution to his Festschrift a couple of years ago. Now, finally, to stop with an anecdote about Ernst Gellner, as a possibly undergraduate student, he was a president of something like the Liberal Club, and they invited either Popper or Hayek to be a guest speaker. And this young fellow found himself at dinner with Popper and Hayek and others. And he got talking to Popper, and Popper said, "You probably ought to read my book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, but you should read it critically." So a few weeks later, he got something like 50 pages of highly critical comments on his book from essentially an undergraduate. And that's Ernst Gellner for you.
Do we know what Popper's reaction to the criticism was?
No, I don't, actually.
Yeah, that would be
But Gellner did convene a conference. He convened a conference on Popper, I think. He didn't live to attend the conference, but the instructions he gave out to contributors were to be as critical as they could. You know the story about that, Jeremy.
Not really. The volume is the one that Jarvie and Pralong edited.
Oh, that's it, yeah.
And there is a bit about Gellner's contribution to getting the thing going in the introductory material to that.
Yeah, that's the story. Yeah.
very interesting. Harry, you raised your hand?
It's a question from the last.
Oh wait, I'll just ask you to unmute again. There you go.
Sorry, it's a question for Rafe, I guess. Do you have anything to add to what Jeremy had to say about Jarvie's revolution in anthropology? I'm particularly interested in that, his earliest published work, I think.
Yes, well, I've got an interest in that too, because one of my friends was an anthropologist, but the cargo cults are a particularly interesting phenomenon. Basically, it involves people going through the motions of doing something, hoping they'll get a result. And the great physicist Richard Feynman described a lot of science as cargo cult science, because the scientists are going through the motions of what they think scientists are doing to get results, but they're actually not. I think that's very astute. The other person who's important in anthropology was an Australian who applied Popper's methodology or methods, critical methods, to undermine or possibly destroy the reputation of Margaret Mead, who was completely fooled by the natives and put out a lot of very dubious work because it wasn't properly criticised.
Was that destruction, quotes destruction, relatively recent, where they basically re-interviewed some of the people and showed that she had allowed her prejudices in favour of a sort of 60s hip sort of style culture to change her attitudes to her interlocutors when she was in, or to colour her.
So they basically told her what she wanted to hear, but
that's right.
True.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I must check. I think I've read that criticism. I can't put my finger on the name at the moment, or my tongue on the name. Do you have the name of that person? The critic.
Freeman is the name. Yeah.
Say again.
The last name is Freeman, I think.
Freeman. Okay, thank you.
Derek.
Possibly Derek Freeman.
Thank you.
Yep. Kane, I understand that. Sorry, Kang. I understand that you had a question for Jeremy.
Yes, thank you for giving me an opportunity. And was Popper? I have two questions. They are very simple but essential. Was Popper imperialist or rationalist? Second, was Popper conservative or liberalist? That's your.
Sorry, I didn't catch the second of those. Could you repeat the second?
Was Popper conservative or liberal?
Sorry, you're asking conservative or liberal?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I just didn't hear very clearly. Okay, Popper's view was influenced in important ways by Immanuel Kant, who is often depicted as drawing both on rationalism and empiricism. But Popper's view was that there aren't fixed categories of the understanding as Kant thought, but rather there are psychological anticipations of the world, and indeed that our biology can be seen as anticipating how the world might be structured, but that all of that is fallible. It can then be appraised by way of criticism or empirically, but he's got a distinctive view of the character of our understanding of the empirical world on the basis of which it's appraised. As to politics, I think that Popper's views can be seen as distinctive. When he was young, he was a socialist. He became convinced that socialist ideas about nationalization and so on were naive, but he was willing that people could experiment with nationalization in cases where otherwise there were problems. However, his own view was a rather radical one, in the sense that he thought that what mattered was people's freedom, but also that we should try to remedy suffering and injustice, and that there should be a program of piecemeal experimentation with critical feedback in tackling these things. So those are the short answers. If you want more, send me an email and I will be happy to give you suggestions about other things you could look at.
Thank you very much.
Margareta? I just ask you
yeah.
to, yeah, there you
Okay, sorry for that noise. This all the information that appears in the chat room, I just want to let you know that will go to our Karl Popper website, so you can find there all the contact information for people who don't have email addresses and so. And my question is maybe related to what Professor Hakohen will be saying. But I was curious about the Republic of Science, because we haven't really talked about that. Dus that is a book that Ian wrote and that got published in 2001. And so that's the reason I think that maybe Professor Hakohen has something to comment on it. But I think maybe other people like Jeremy and Rafe and Nimrod, that this is really a very important book. And it's listed just on the website for people who want to take the title down. But anyway, I let now you talk about that book and why that is so important. And finally, before I turn off my mic, I'm very glad to hear about this dynamic. So that Ian was kind of a modest, shy person, because I contacted some of his students and they said to me, oh no, we shouldn't remember Ian. We shouldn't do anything. And I thought, oh my God, how can they say that? Like, after this scholar has published so many books, how can we pretend that he didn't do anything? So of course, we're going to make sure that everyone knows about the work of Ian. And so now I'll turn off my Professor Hakohen. You can say a little about the Republic of Science.
Yes. So first, I put in the chat both the reference to the book on the Republic of Science and the one to the Festschrift from 2018 that was edited by Nathaniel Laor and by Raphael Sassower. Okay, so you now have both references on the chat. I'm so glad that Margareta mentioned the Republic of Science. I wanted to add that to the very helpful overviews that were given earlier by both by Jeremy, by Rafi, and by Nimrod of Ian. The big question and the big challenge that always seemed to me Popperian philosophy of science encountered is that, at least to me, no one has described an ideal process for science as well as Popper has. And the question was always, does this work in reality this way? We do know that a good number of scientists were fond of Popper's description and saw that it corresponded to what they did. But throughout my career, challenges have emerged from science studies indicating that this is simply not the way science works, that ideal process of conjectures and refutations. And so what is needed in order to vindicate the possibilities of a Popperian philosophy of science is a form of sociology about which Popper was rather reluctant. Remember, Popper thought that the move from epistemology to sociology in order to resolve the epistemological question is a bad move, right? What Ian did is Ian went and showed how in Popper's own work, in Logik der Forschung, in the logic of scientific discovery, there are already the rudiments of a sociology of science that is of a description, a sociological description, the way in which intersubjective criticism work, and of the social institutions that are required for this type of intersubjectivity to work. To me, this was an opening. I was not as persuaded as Ian was that sociology was fully developed in Popper, but it certainly represented to me the direction in which Popperian scholars should move. And Ian was the pioneer here.
When did Ian publish this view the first time?
2001, but he anticipated by essays that came out in advance during the 90s.
Mm-hmm. And Popper passed away when? Please remind.
94.
94. Uh-huh.
So I'm curious, what was the role of Joseph Agassi then in this dynamic with Ian, in terms of, was he like the sounding board that that pushed back, or was he just kind of encouraging and intrigued? Or could Nimrod or Jeremy comment on that?
I think the first step goes to Gellner and their interest in Gellner, because Gellner put I mean, anyone coming from sociology cannot deny that institutions are something more real than an individualist would allow, let's say. So, and their respect for Gellner was that he made this clear in his criticism of Watkins, I think. And this is what brought them to study his work and to publish his papers. They are the editors of Gellner's papers. And what Jarvie stressed and Malachi explained so beautifully, I think, is that both Popper and Kuhn also were advancing a sociology of science against their will. Because once you say criticism depends on institutions that encourage it and make it difficult to be defensive. It's not that scientists are not defensive or dogmatic or that they don't have paradigms. Yes, they do. But in science, admitting your errors openly is appreciated and correcting them is respected. And so without those institutions, you would not have the mark of science, which is openness to criticism. And this is, I think, the main theme of Jarvie's book. That is the main point, I think.
Stephen, I think you had your hand raised first.
Yeah. Yeah, I just, before we wind up, I did want to say some more personal things about Ian that ought to be brought out, that he was really a lived Popperian. When he edited Philosophy of Social Science and solicited book reviews and so forth, it was always to get a controversy. He wanted to see criticism and refutation. That was the way he edited the journal, and that's what he wanted to have happen. He was absolutely opposed to orthodoxies and uncritically accepted orthodoxies. And that journal then became a opportunity for people to say things that they couldn't say elsewhere. And for all of those years that he invested in that journal, it was a location where open discussion could happen. And he put in a tremendous amount of work into that journal. He loved editing. He cleaned up people's prose. He encouraged discussion, and it's a real legacy that the original 4 people that started it all fell away at various points for age or health or death, and he was the survivor and carried it on his back. And it's a very demanding thing to do. It's really a tremendous legacy that hopefully will be preserved in the future. And his student Ki Yoshida is currently running the journal and has the same kind, has really the Jarvie ethic as well, which he got from being Jarvie's assistant at York. So, and I want to also add, as people have mentioned, his great sense of humor. We had him for a visit to talk about film once, and he talked about Woody Allen, the humor of Woody Allen. And so, and we had also a colleague of mine who was a student of Agassi, and who we were sitting at dinner, and he was talking about his relation to Agassi and how generous Agassi was to him and how kind and so on and so forth. And when he left, Ian said, "No one talks about Agassi that way." It was definitely a quirk of this guy's personality, but nevertheless had a positive experience and went on to write on philosophy of archaeology, through his relation with Colin Renfrew, who was a Popperian himself. So there's so many extensions of these ideas that were enabled by Ian and by Agassi, that it's important to focus on the philosophy, but it's also important to see how much impact they had on everything that was going on around them at the time, and how much positive impact, because the need to struggle against the concretized orthodoxies is a permanent problem of academic life. And Ian was a sort of a crusader against it. So I'll quit with that, but there are many instances I can give of his both critical capacity, but also generosity and support of other people. And I've always thought of him as one of the angels that has, helped me through life, that at crucial moments was able to do something useful for me, and very generously. He really supported people, and that's an important legacy. So thanks.
I would also add that his really remarkable ability as an editor, he learned from John Wisdom. And I think one of his conditions to establishing a philosophy of the social sciences was that Wisdom will work with him. Wisdom was the first editor of BJPS. And if I'm not mistaken, Jarvie was working and learning the craft under him at the BJPS. And that Wisdom is another very interesting and deep thinker in the broader family of critical rationalism that Ian was able to bring to York at the end of his career.
Margarita, did you have something?
Yes, maybe several questions actually, but maybe first for Stefan, for those who don't know, how did you get to know Ian Jarvie? Just how did you get in touch with him? Because many of us don't know, I think, at least the younger generation, and I consider myself one of them.
You want me to respond?
Yeah, how did you get
sure.
to know Ian Jarvie?
Well, that's sort of interesting, because I was working in philosophy of science. I had read a lot of Popper. I used Popperian ideas on probability and so on and so forth, but wasn't connected to wasn't taught by anybody who was a critical rationalist. It was just something I
Mm-hmm.
absorbed. And after publishing some things in philosophy of social science, it happened that I was at a American Political Science Association meeting, and I think this is actually a good indication of Jarvie's range. That I gave a paper in the Foundations of Political Thought subsection or program, and Fred Edlin said, "Oh, come to dinner with us." And Jarvie was there, and a whole bunch of Popper-oriented people were there. You may remember that Fred ran a little newsletter for a few years of people associated with Popperian ideas. Many of whom, probably most of whom, were in the social sciences in various ways. And that's something that, of course, Jarvie was well attuned to. He was absolutely comfortable and outside of the bubble of academic philosophy, and reached out and understood that the Popperian ideas were crucial for the intellectual development of many people, and needed their support. And so that was a case. Then after that, I visited him in Toronto and saw him at the meetings of the Roundtable of Philosophy of Social Science, which he occasionally came to, and was always a very shrewd and, as an editor, very shrewd judge of people's work and capacity. And and he was sort of silently there supporting people. He was never sort of aggressively attacking anybody or anything like that, but he was always able to say something shrewd about what was going on. And so it was always good to talk to him. No matter what you felt about what was going on, he had nice stable understanding of it to communicate with you. But I think the main thing is he wanted discussion. He wanted conjectures and refutations, and he really worked institutionally to make that happen. So.
So I have perhaps another question for who can answer it, like Nimrod or Jeremy, now that Professor Hakoven is gone. So you mentioned psychoanalysis and Gellner, and I looked at it, his book that is critical of psychoanalysis. But when I read Karl Popper, dus in the beginning he says it's not a science, but then when you read his books later on, it kind of comes up and then it disappears, it comes up, it disappears. That he has, that he makes comments on psychoanalysis that seems that he's actually working with some of those ideas. And so I was curious what your view was then on, I apologize for that noise, the interaction between Ian Gellner, Ian Jarvie, and Stefan, maybe you can enlighten, and psychoanalysis, like, so were they all going to be consistently against it, or were they actually willing to say that there is some interesting ideas here? And maybe that's also, yes, Jeremy, yeah.
If I can comment briefly, certainly when I was at the LSE, Gellner was I think, possibly professor, that's the top rank of philosophy, but based in the Department of Sociology. And so he wasn't a member of Popper's department. I don't know of there being any interaction between him and the people who were in Popper's department, although my understanding is that when Agassi was at the LSE, and possibly Jarvie as well, there was interaction. My own impression, having read his work and having had him as a lecturer, was that he wasn't particularly sympathetic to Popper's philosophical ideas. He seemed more to be concerned with somehow keeping alive what he thought was the critical spirit of logical positivism as an approach which set out to engage in some ways destructively with received ideas. But certainly he seemed to me not to have any positive suggestions as to what philosophical approach could actually play that role. In terms of psychoanalysis, Popper himself had interactions with Adler and knew about psychoanalysis when he was in Vienna. There is one short discussion of an aspect of psychoanalysis in the postscript, and there are odd comments and suggestions elsewhere. He seems really to have suggested that it could, I mean, ideas from psychoanalysis could, to use his slightly later terminology, form the basis of a metaphysical research program, but he seemed to be rather critical both of the substantive ideas, but also, I think, one has to bear in mind of the incredible cult of psychoanalysis. I mean, really, people took this garbage seriously, and it was organized like a bloody religion. So from that point of view, there was an openness to intellectual engagement. On the other hand, why I thought Gellner's book was interesting was that he adopted the kind of critical perspective to the development of aspects of psychoanalysis as the school of exactly the kind the critical rationalism calls for. The problem really was that the number of critical rationalists was tiny. They tended really to work in rather narrowly the history and philosophy of particularly natural science, and there just weren't the people to get involved in this. There were people who were interested. John Alton Wisdom was keen on Popper's approach, but was also keen on psychoanalysis. I haven't gone through his work to see what his systematic treatment of these things was. And there was also a guy called Bernard Burgoyne, who was a student at the LSE. He worked briefly as Popper's research assistant, and I think he's currently heading some psychoanalytic outfit. I think somewhere I suspect in Hampstead in London, which would be the sort of place one might expect that to be located. But I guess my view is this is one of the kind of oodles of areas in which work needs to be done, but there basically just wasn't anyone to do it.
Thank you.
All right, Jeremy, since you used the word garbage, psychoanalysis, it talks about repression, and that's exactly, Popper is all about that we need to overcome dogmatism and understand it. So in that way, I thought there is somewhere a connection, but you're totally right. Some psychoanalysis turn it in a cult, but it's not everyone. So I just
But what one needs is the articulation, critical appraisal, and testability of the theory, whereas the way in which it was set up systematically avoided doing that and avoided confronting critics in a serious way. But just think of how many people's lives were ruined by this cult, and think also of the vast amounts of money that was extracted from the gullible, and think also of the horrific impact that this uncritical mythology has had on literature, on art, on all kinds of things. I mean, there may indeed be interesting ideas there, but how it was developed is just about the antithesis of this. And I mean, it's one of the few things where people, for the most part, still get kind of treated a little bit like the way in which in the 19th century, people would have been thrown out of the room as a blasphemer if they actually express skepticism about it.
Yeah, I believe it's also in Conjectures and Reputations, chapter 1, Science, Conjectures and Reputations, where Popper goes into a bit more about the pseudoscientific character of psychoanalysis. So if anyone's interested to read more about that. Yes,
but Elise, since you bring up that book, that's the same book in which he has a paper that says actually psychoanalysis is right. But the terminology, people can disagree. He says it describes the thinking of primitives and little children. And I would say maybe also of adults, but may I just defer this topic down to another time, because Alex Naraniecki is here now, and we were hoping. So, yeah, Elise, I'll give it back to you.
I was just going to just have a couple closing comments for Ian Jarvie. So we'll be discussing a little bit more about him and why his work was so important in the next meet and greet, which will be the second week of January 2024. We're also going to be creating a dedicated page for him on the karlpopper.net website, where it can be available to anyone who wants to have more of a deep dive into his work. And if anyone does want to continue with the discussion of remembering Ian Jarvie, you're more than welcome to jump into the breakout room that we have, which is more on Ian Jarvie. But now we are going to be moving on to Alex Naranyaki.